Welcome back. The Israeli government and the Palestinian Authority should rebuild confidence, resume negotiations and make all efforts to halt violence. This was one of the recommendations by George Mitchell in 2001. And since then, the crisis, the players, the region and the politics surrounding it have changed. To begin with, the Palestinians were under the strong leadership of Yasser Arafat, but now they are divided into two main political factions, Hamas and Fatah, involved in their own conflict. On the other side of the border, Israel is due to elect a new government in less than 2 weeks. The next Israeli Prime Minister will be crucial in negotiating the way forward. And while negotiations and peace plans failed, it was resistance that ultimately forced Israel to withdraw from Gaza in 2005. Also, Iran has evolved into an influential regional power, supporting anti-American sentiments and resistance in Gaza. And finally, the US has its hands full with Iraq and Afghanistan and its troubled economy. Still with us are our guests in Washington, D.C., David Mack, also in the US capital, Khaled Zafouri, and in London, Ian Black. David Mack, can I come to you? When this tour ends, what can we expect, or what do you think you expect to be in the report that will be submitted to Hillary Clinton?
Well, immediately there's going to be Mitchell's evaluation of the potential for actually tightening up on the arms traffic into Gaza, which obviously has to be done in exchange for opening up peaceful commerce in and out of Gaza. You obviously cannot expect the Gazans not to continue to use tunnels when they're not able to bring in traffic overland. So he's going to have to evaluate that with the possible, with his assessment of whether you can get some European or United Nations inspectors at those border crossing points as a way of relieving some Israeli anxieties and encouraging the Israelis to open them up to normal commerce.
Ian Black, from a European perspective, and certainly from London, where we've seen so many demonstrations in support of what happened recently in the war on Gaza, what do you expect George Mitchell to put in that report? You've heard what David Mack's just said.
Well, I think David's right about the first stage. The first stage clearly has to be something that will stabilise the situation in and around Gaza. Otherwise, what happened over the 3 weeks from December the 27th could well happen again. We saw yesterday a significant incident on the border. It's a highly unstable situation. There has to be a trade-off of some kind. The details need to be determined between opening the crossing points into Gaza, particularly the Rafah crossing point into Egypt, which is Gaza's lifeline to the Arab and the wider world, and Israeli concerns about security and the tunnels, and clearly the two are linked. That's the first stage, but the second stage has to be to look beyond that to the to dealing with any prospects for resuming political track. That has to include, in my view, a significant element of Palestinian reconciliation, and it will have to take into account, timing is a little difficult because I assume Mitchell will finish before the Israeli election, but any plan will have to take into account the likely outcome of the Israeli election on February the 10th, and the polls show a likely victory for Netanyahu and the Likud. But I mean, there's the first stage, the immediate problem of Gaza. The second stage has to be, how can the peace process, if there is going to be one at all, be put back on track?
Khaled Zafouri, how problematic then is it for George Mitchell to really say anything of substance while, as Ian Black said, we have this Israeli election pending in just a few weeks' time?
I think a lot will depend on these elections, and I think this George Mitchell's tour to Middle East now is one step, and I don't think it's the final one. He's just preparing for the serious talks, but the serious talks will have to wait till after the Israeli elections. And beside the situation in Gaza, I don't think the situation in the West Bank is much better. There are over 600 checkpoints, and Israelis have tight hands all over. They restrict movements between parts. And so I think we will have to wait for the Israeli elections. That's what the report will wait for. He will give a preliminary opinion on the situation to the president in preparation for the next step, which is waiting for the Israeli elections and then moving seriously. And I think some of it will require the president to make some phone calls directly to Middle Eastern leaders in order to push the situation or push the talks forward. Also, it's an important factor here. I think continue to ignore Hamas and its role in Gaza is not going to help the situation, because like Mr. Black said, what happened yesterday in Gaza, I think there are some fighting today also, some minor skirmishes, but I think things could escalate even before the Israeli elections. And I think some kind of contacts with Hamas is essential in order to secure at least calm situation in the next few weeks.
Ian Black nodding there, but David Mack, let me just bring you in here diplomatically. I wanted to bring in this whole issue of starting dialogue with Hamas. You know, should it, shouldn't it happen? It's a debate that's been happening with analysts and diplomats across the world. I mean, what's your take on it? And we've had the White House spokesperson saying that George Mitchell will not be meeting or speaking to Hamas yet. Is that the sort of soundings you would expect from the White House in terms of Hamas? Do they have to be brought into this? Surely they have to be brought into this discussion.
Well, the president has made it clear that he wants Mitchell to be in contact and U.S. diplomats to be in contact with all the states of the region, all the Arab states, certainly including Syria. However, in the case of Hamas, I would suspect that in the near term, what the United States is going to be exploring through George Mitchell's discussions out there is whether there aren't possibilities for creating some kind of government of national unity between Hamas and Fatah, PLO, that would enable us, in effect, to deal with a Palestinian partner that would include Hamas representation. That would be a way of getting around this dilemma where the Obama administration clearly does not want to undercut what remains of the presidency of Mahmoud Abbas, Abu Mazen, as something I would say that the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Jordanians all want as well.
Isn't there a point of view, though, Ian Black, that when George Mitchell dealt with the IRA, the British government termed them a terrorist group, but yet they were treated with respect when it came to negotiations? What's so different with the Hamas-Israel scenario that still allows most of the world to regard Hamas as a terrorist group?
Well, what's different is a very fundamental point, that when George Mitchell was trying to knock heads together in Northern Ireland, the principal representative of the Republican community, or the armed wing of that community, was the IRA. There was a smaller splinter group or two here or there, but the analogy is the IRA then was in the same position as the PLO used to be, or Fatah used to be, in the Palestinian context. What you have today in the Palestinian context is very different. You have Mahmoud Abbas in the West Bank representing Fatah and the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, and then you have Hamas controlling the Gaza Strip with some presence in the West Bank, and these two movements are completely at loggerheads. So there's both a practical difficulty of how you deal with the Palestinian people when their representatives are divided between two rival camps, and then there is the political difficulty that Israel has negotiated with the Palestinian Authority, and it's been fully supported by the United States and the rest of the international community. So a decision to talk directly to Hamas has quite far-reaching implications. I agree with David Mack absolutely that the way that this will work is not that there will suddenly be American recognition of or direct and public dealings with Hamas as a separate player, but that the efforts will be devoted, with Arab help, with Saudi, Egyptian and others, to bring the Palestinians back together again. Because if the Palestinians don't get back together again, then in my view, nothing can actually happen. It is a prerequisite for any kind of progress at all. Mitchell, it seems to me, will have to be thinking along those lines.
Well, we're just coming to near the end of our programme. I just want your final thought on the issue of direct talks, and that backdoor negotiations can sometimes explode in diplomats' faces to a certain extent. David Mack, what do you make of that? Do you think that any negotiation should be quite direct?
Well, Suhail, I think what we have to recognize is that the Obama administration, President Obama himself, are very conscious of the fact that we can no longer do these things unilaterally. We should we should get some leverage by using allies, by using partners, and in particularly by using partners like the Turks, who've been trying to negotiate and mediate between Israel and Syria, by using the Egyptians and the Saudis, who've been trying to bring Fatah and Hamas together. So I think that one of the things that we can do that will be a big change from the Bush administration, which had blocked the mediation of other parties, is to support the mediation efforts of Europeans, Turks, Egyptians, Jordanians, and Saudis.
Well, for the moment there, I think we'll have to leave it, but of course we'll always be keeping a very close eye on this subject here on Al Jazeera and Inside Story. David Mack in Washington, Ian Black in London, and Khalid Sufuri also in Washington. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story.
You're welcome.
And thank you so much for joining us here on the programme. Of course, we do welcome your comments and suggestions. Please do email them to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. I'm Sahil Rahman. Thanks very much for your time. Bye for now.